Media.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Bookbytes. I have an extremely interesting research document in the form of this new publication that's just being launched around the country as we speak, The Blinded City, a documentation of 10 years in inner city Johannesburg. For many of us who've lived in Johannesburg or have passed through it, Johannesburg is the heartbeat of Africa. But there's also a lot going on behind the scenes that anthropologists and sociologists have been documenting over, well, centuries. The most current research is by anthropologist, academic, and writer Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon, who's a writer, educator, editor, who was born in Johannesburg, has worked as a lecturer, researcher, and writing fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand over the past decade. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford and has published widely in international journals and the South African media, as well as speaking internationally about his research on Johannesburg. This very important new book, The Blinded City, recounts the history of inner city Johannesburg from 2010 to 2019, primarily from the perspectives of the so-called unlawful occupiers of spaces known as hijacked buildings, bad buildings, or dark buildings. Tens of thousands of residents, both South African and foreign national, live in these buildings in dire conditions. This book tells the important story of these sites, the court cases around them, and how this has shaped living and accommodation within the city, and the discussions which strike at the center of who has the right to occupy the city. It takes, it's a great pleasure to welcome Matthew on to the show this evening. Matthew, welcome, and thank you so much for giving us of your time this evening so we can hear about the significant research that you've spent the last decade documenting. Congratulations on a fantastic publication.
Thank you, and thank you very much for reading and for the invitation.
So, to dive right in, The Blinded City, I mean, there's so much, and the compassion with which you write this important documentation. Tell us about your decade-long research and getting into this story of both migrants and residents in inner city Johannesburg, and what's it been like for you? What's the process been like for you?
Well, it didn't start out. It wasn't planned to be a decade-long project. It started out actually with a news piece I wrote for Mail and Guardian in late 2010 on a Doctors Without Borders project, where they had done a survey that found that tens of thousands of people in inner city Johannesburg were living in conditions worse than international standards for refugee camps. And so as part of that piece, I visited one of these unlawful occupations called Chambers in New Doornfontein. And it was really striking, only a few minutes from my family home, the kind of extremity of the dereliction in which people were living. Both South Africans and foreign nationals were living in this building. And so when I came back, I'd been doing research in northern Uganda for my doctorate. When I came back for postdoctoral work at the African Center for Migration and Society, I carried on with the research with Doctors Without Borders, but later by myself, looking at these unlawful occupations. And so the research gradually unfolded over the course of a decade. I had other projects too, but this was the one that kind of remained, I kept on coming back to. And so The Blinded City is an attempt to consolidate that, but also tell that story in a narrative form, a form which is accessible to a general audience, not just an academic audience. And very important for me is that it reaches a wider South African audience.
And I believe you've made this indeed a very tangible read, because an important story, a human story, needs to be able to reach and should be widely read. And so you've definitely captured that and successfully managed that. The sort of reading the story, not just to understand and appreciate the importance of the telling, but also the horrors that are depicted. We often think of Johannesburg, we want to think of Johannesburg as a world-class city, without making invisible sort of, people who are living in spaces where they don't have the rights and the dignity that, that they're meant to. And so, it makes me question, on the one hand, what does it take to leave, in the case of foreign nationals, for example, what does it take to leave the country of your, home? These forced migrations that we speak of, what does it take to be sort of ejected from home because home is no longer that safe space, and then have to put up with what is considered this golden opportunity, coming to Johannesburg, and it's not really that. The horrific conditions under which people have been living in inner city Johannesburg. Speak to us about your observations, which you so vividly capture in the book. Tell us about some of those experiences and what that has meant for you as a researcher, but also just as a human being witnessing these horrors, really.
Well, I think that many migrants who come to Johannesburg and live in these dire conditions don't stay here because it's an ideal space. Of course, it's not. It's very insecure, living often without basic services, under conditions, under the threat of deportation, police harassment. And then many who are deported, have been through Lindela, which itself was a very brutal, has been a very brutal and corrupt institution. And many, even despite all of these things, come back because, particularly, for instance, in Zimbabwe, the economic conditions, the political conditions, the ecological conditions are very hard to survive. And I think this is missed a lot in the debate on migration, particularly with the xenophobia that people must just go back. Well, I knew several individuals that chose to go back during the pandemic and have returned to Johannesburg because life just wasn't possible. And I think that's, the system of thinking we can deal with the problem of migration through policing, through deportation, misses that unless there's greater regional stability, or people will continue to come to Johannesburg. And so that's very, I think that's a thread throughout the narrative in the book. But also what's important to note is that these unlawful occupations, so-called hijack buildings, dark buildings, bad buildings, are also occupied by South Africans. Often South Africans and foreign nationals live in the same spaces. And we still have a condition where, Black working classes, both South African and foreign national, live in the midst of the wealthiest country in Africa, the wealthiest, or one of the wealthiest cities in Africa, under extraordinarily dire conditions, often without basic services. And so the approach I took in the book, and while I do look at migration and the deportation system and so on, is really to look at the spaces of these buildings, and look at the stories also of South African residents and how these interweave with the stories of cross-border migrants.
Well, you document something very important, is the cases around, what is the responsibility of the city, in the constitutional responsibility of the city towards human beings resident there. And in particular, the cases. Speak to us about the Blue Moonlight case, for example, which is such a pivotal case. If you can break that down for us, in terms of how accommodation works, in terms of the rights of residents.
Well, the Blue Moonlight case, which I document in the book, which the constitutional judgment given in 2011, built on a series of other constitutional jurisprudence, in particular the case, the well-known housing case, Grootboom, about the housing activist in Wallerstein in the Western Cape. But what Blue Moonlight really made clear is that the municipality of Johannesburg has a legal obligation to provide what is called temporary emergency accommodation to those who are evicted, who would be rendered homeless. And important in this is that the obligation is, even if it's a private developer cannot evict unless the city then provides temporary emergency accommodation. So this was really a major case, but as I outline in the book, it had unexpected consequences. One of the consequences was the splitting apart of a community. Another consequence was the splitting apart of families. And I tell the story of grandmother Nomsa Edendladler, whose granddaughter was taken away from her because social services, she was put in a shelter, and then social services said, well, this shelter isn't an adequate home. And she was the sole guardian of her granddaughter. And so the impact of that was really devastating. So what seemed like the possibility of a new home actually led to the separation of a family. And then another case under her name, Dladler Constitutional Court case, which ruled against, for instance, lockouts in the shelters, which ruled against the separation of families, which said, well, the rights of dignity, even in a shelter or temporary emergency accommodation, still have to apply. And so these cases, what is clear from the book is, well, constitutional law provides a very strong protection against homelessness. It often takes a very long time for the implications of constitutional court judgments to play out, and the way that they play out on the ground is often unexpected or not, not just what is written in the law.
You also speak about the Maboneng precinct, which we saw, sort of in a wave of development and reconstitution to some degree, and then it kind of, I don't know if it was, I always thought it was COVID, but it seems, as you documented it, that it was before COVID that space also starts to disintegrate and sort of fall out of the hands of, the company that was overseeing it. Or the question I have really is the intentions for gentrification of spaces of the city, while large parts of it still aren't really providing the safety, the dignified housing for residents. Maybe, I don't know if you can comment on some of that.
Yeah, well, I think at the beginning of the decade, when I started the research and when Maboneng under the perpetuity was expanding, there was a huge amount of positivity in the media around urban regeneration in Johannesburg, around inclusive regeneration, and so on. And that wasn't entirely untrue. A place like Maboneng created an important social space, important cultural space, whatever, and so on. But not just perpetuity, but other property developers, what has been clear is that they haven't catered for the poorest and most precarious populations in the inner city. And that was always the concern, is beneath the sort of celebration of urban regeneration in Johannesburg, you had a whole class of people who were being gradually, who weren't being accommodated. And this is still the case now. It might, I think it's marginally improved because of the cases. There has been some expansion of affordable accommodation, but we still have the case now, 10 years later, where that kind of vision of regenerating the city hasn't worked to the extent that it hasn't been inclusive of the most precarious populations in the inner city. And I think, as much as the private sector has an important role to play in developing housing, and it has developed, thousands of units which are accessible to working class populations with salaries. Ultimately, the private sector won't accommodate the lowest economic groups because it's just not profitable. It has to be an intervention by the state or by NGOs or collaborations, between the state and private sector NGOs. And that's still, I think that there's been a realization by the city of Johannesburg and an attempt to expand affordable accommodation, but it's nowhere near catering the needs. And at the same time, you have thousands of households still living in unlawful occupations. According to the most recent estimates by the city, they think that they, under Blue Moonlight, are potentially obligated to provide temporary emergency accommodation for 10,000 households, but there's only a few thousand units available. So I think that it's very important that there's some movement to provide at least basic services to those who are living in unlawful occupations, to improve water, sanitation, at least basic, protection against fire and so on.
And when we talk about numbers, I mean, always there's this talk to sort of keep to fulfill a demand of a certain number, if that's 10,000, without taking into consideration that this is a dynamic that changes. The need is increasing all the time, So in your book, you do raise questions around the responsibility of the private sector versus the state, and you see through changing leadership, there are these attempts by different mayors to try and sort of arrange for this demand to be met. But in some cases, the acts of xenophobia and reaching into the rhetoric of xenophobia is a cop-out that doesn't actually solve these issues and these problems. How far have we come? I mean, this is a new book, but at the same time, what's the current dynamic around dealing with solving this issue of not just temporary accommodation, but rehousing and adequately housing people in the inner city?
Well, I think the problem is that it's temporary emergency accommodation has become essentially permanent. Gladly is still living in the shelter. There are other cases where people have been living in temporary emergency accommodation for more than 10 years. So de facto temporary emergency accommodation isn't temporary at all. So you're not going to deal with the problem only through evicting and putting people in temporary emergency accommodation, because it's just not enough. And without a pathway into affordable accommodation, people will remain in temporary emergency accommodation for who knows how long. And so the solution has to be an expansion of affordable accommodation. And I think under Parks Tau, the former NCMA, there was a recognition, and they developed a plan called iChip to do that. The mayoral council under Mashaba accepted that, and so there has been an acceptance now that is the route to take. But the projects have been underfunded, and there's just nowhere near the capacity, and it will take years and years. And as you said, it's very volatile. There are these numbers, but they change all the time. And there's not really reliable statistics. I go over this, the statistics I could find in the book, but no one really knows the exact numbers. They're all estimates, and it's changing. And so I think there has to be an acceptance of, unlawful occupiers, a basic right to dignity, and trying to improve living conditions. Even, that's not a perfect solution, but it's a better solution than having people live without water, exposed to fire, exposed to, often their kids and families are living in very poor conditions. And the problem again is, and subsequent administrations, but it was particularly ramped up under Mashaba, is the use of these large-scale police raids against the buildings to try to clear them out, often justified, by migration, but they also ended up targeting a number of South Africans. And Seri took a case, and the High Court and Constitutional Court found that these raids were unconstitutional. The use of the section of the Police Act that allowed targeting of individual rooms without a police warrant, or just cordoning of areas, was unconstitutional. And they just aren't effective. They aren't effective as long to, these large police raids are, take place under the justification of public order, but they have very little impact on actually dealing with crime, and actually dealing with protecting women against sexual violence, on actually, improving the security and well-being. And so I think that the city really needs to think, not just the city, but the country, the model of policing that is used, particularly in precarious populations, and the ways in which the lowest income groups can actually be protected by the police or protected by the city, and rather than seeing just as the source of criminality.
I mean, to go back a little, when you talk about this Operation Fiela, and it immediately reminded me what you're documenting about Johannesburg. There's spaces around the country in different cities where, for example, when, in the lead up to the World Cup 2010, there was this clean up operation. And this feeling of, I know I witnessed it out in Polokwane, Warwick Junction, in Durban, experienced it, and you talk about it very vividly as it happened in Johannesburg as well. And there's been this domino effect of just removing, cleaning up, and this rhetoric around dirty buildings being cleaned up. So to undo, sort of the negative connotations to begin with, by, because this dehumanizes people who are seeking safety in these spaces, whether they're foreign nationals or South Africans. It takes work to undo the negative rhetoric around what it means to clean up a city, or rather just to say it will help. Do you think it will help for the private sector and government to come together and say it actually serves the private sector, private companies, to assist the funding of better conditions, better living conditions for people in the inner city, and not take the cop out of we'll just take them out and put them into tents somewhere and then sort them out after 6 months, which is not happening. So it's rather undignified to do that, I think, when you're reading it just as an outsider perspective.
Well, I think that's the point, but you can displace the issue, but it doesn't solve the issue. So you can displace people to the peripheries, or these tent encampments like there is in Turffontein, or put people in the street, or but that doesn't take that precarity away. In fact, I think it worsens insecurity, because you are, it's like, what we've seen with targeting informal trade as well. How is it a meaningful security response to take away the minimal livelihoods that people have to survive? You worsen precarity, and in some senses you strengthen the criminal networks. And I'm not denying that there aren't criminal networks in these spaces, but often it's the poorest that are victims of these criminality, and particularly women. And these strategies of clearing out, raiding, eviction often make the most vulnerable more precarious, rather than actually providing protection. So it's complex and multi-layered, but I think a key element and a key message of the book is that there has to be an attempt, at least by the city, to engage these populations in a meaningful way, to form relationships. And it's not impossible. There's a document in the book, groups like Inner City Federation exist. There are housing activists and networks that exist for that engagement to take place. They really struggle to get a meaningful response from the city, or the city actually to engage them in a serious way. And I think that has to happen. And the more you raid, the more you try to clean out, the more you build distrust, and you take away that space of engagement. And I think that these policies worsen insecurity, even though they are geared towards making the city more secure. And criticism against colleagues, civil society, myself, is, oh, you're supporting criminality. Well, no, that's not the case. I would also like a secure city, but I would like a city where it's safe for women to walk the streets. But these methods just haven't worked. They've been tried again and again, this very militaristic approach towards policing, and there's no evidence that they work. And what they do is then really target precarious populations.
Absolutely. And I think, it's it's not correct also to have to sort of wash over the entire space of inner city living as criminals. And so I think that's what makes a book of this nature important. And I hope that it's widely read and engaged, not just within the academy, but in the public space as you've made it available. And so that's why I refer to it as an important book. And obviously 10 years of research having culminated into a project of this nature, speaks to the success of your intention and your documentation of this project. Matthew, we've come to the end of our session, but I am highly, grateful and enlightened by the research that you've captured here. And I certainly hope that it catapults further discussion around what needs to be done for your intentions, your vision to create a safer space within the city, so that we may all reclaim the city in positive ways.
Thanks so much. And as much as I hope that the book is read, I think what's really important is that it's. As much as I hope the book is part of the conversation, that the conversation includes the residents and of the buildings themselves and the inner city themselves. And I think that has to take place for meaningful pathway forward. But I really appreciate this invitation and your insights and conversation. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. And once again, thank you for your time and for putting this document together so vividly and so with such significant fact-finding and analysis for us. And once again, thank you for giving us your time, and we wish you everything of the best as you tour the country with your launches. I know you have a whole spate of launches coming out in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, and around the city, and we look forward to those. I'm sure readers will be able to catch you online and at these different spaces through your social media and via Pan Macmillan's site as well. So best wishes on that, on the book tour.
Thank you so much. Take care.
And so there you have it. We spoke to anthropologist Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon about The Blinded City. I urge you to get a copy to read this important book that documents the 10 years of his research in inner city Johannesburg and the conversation around dignified human settlement for residents and migrants living within the city, and what the city can do about it, what private property owners can do about it. And it's an important discussion. Do get in and join the launches as well. That's it from me for this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.